Welcome back to the Jews for Jesus series on Arabian Judaea Part 2. In this part, I will show the counter-evidence to the hypothesis presented in Part 1. So first, does the Bible speak about Egypt when it talks about Egypt? Absolutely yes. The book of Exodus, chapter 1, verse 11, speaks about the cities of Pithom and Ramesses. While Pithom has not been conclusively identified yet, the structure of its name fits well the Egyptian way of naming cities as the House of Atum. Ramesses, on the other hand, has been identified as Pi-Ramesses in Egypt. But how about the contention of the Badr Society that the Quran speaks about the pharaoh as if it was a proper name? Firun. Does one really expect from a text written more than 1,000 years after the event it described to maintain all the tiny details like the definite article? Probably not. Moreover, the books of Kings and Chronicles actually name Shishak, an Egyptian pharaoh who conquered parts of the biblical lands. And these biblical lands have been found in a different place by archaeologists. They found a portal in Karnak, Egypt, describing a pharaoh, Sheshonq, and his victories over several biblical places, like Megiddo. Now, Salibi might have objected, saying that the Bible and the Karnak portal mention actually the places in Arabia. But there is a stele found in Megiddo, in today's Israel, mentioning Sheshonq. So it's kind of dropping a visiting card. So what? Sheshonq might have conquered both today's Israel and Arabia. There are also other witnesses made of stone that contradict Salibi's hypothesis. The Moab stone, found in Diban at the Jordanian Dead Sea shore, it mentions Omri, the king of Israel, who oppressed Moab until King Mesha of Moab managed to free Moab from Israel. Moab and Omri are also mentioned in the Bible, but Salibi was aware of this stone, and his response was something like that. Moab was indeed in the vicinity of Arabian Israel. Once Moab freed themselves from Israel, they went north to the Dead Sea and built the inscriptions we are talking about. The biblical Omri is said to have built the city of Samaria. In Samaria, in today's Israel, ostraca with Hebrew inscriptions have been found. Salibi knows about them and says that they merely prove that Hebrew-speaking people had lived in Samaria in the 9th century BCE, which he does not dispute. He only disputes that the Samaria the ostraca have been found in is the biblical one. Similarly, the Hebrew inscription in the Gihon water tunnel of Jerusalem is just evidence that Hebrew-speaking people were living in the area of today's Jerusalem and were building tunnels. But there were tunnels built all over the world, so it's not necessarily the biblical Gihon tunnel. Salibi's thesis is now different from what the Badr Society presents it like. It has no use for anti-Zionist propaganda, if studied in detail, as Salibi concedes that Hebrew-speaking people used to live in today's Israel almost 3 millennia ago. What Salibi in fact does is what a scientist should do. He has made an observation, he concluded from this observation to a hypothesis, and then he tested the hypothesis, but as we show later, tested it insufficiently. Salibi's conclusion about the biblical lands in Arabia might remain valid if Pharaoh Sheshonq conquered both the Arabian Israel, for which there is no evidence, and the Israel in modern Israel, which is well attested. The Moab stone was built by pure coincidence next to the land where the same language as the biblical Hebrew was spoken. This would be suspiciously coincidental, even more so if Later on, in the Hellenistic period, this land will be declared the biblical Israel. According to Salibi, it was in the Hellenistic period that the Maccabees have conquered Judea from the Seleucid Greeks, and to magnify their achievements, they declared the land that they conquered as the biblical Israel. The subsequent translation of the Torah from Hebrew into Greek used already this identification. The problem with this version is that the Maccabees were not in favor of translating the Torah into Greek. One of the reasons the Maccabees fought the Greeks for was to stop the Hellenization of their culture. The Septuagint was most likely translated in Egypt, which had a large Greek-speaking Jewish diaspora. This diaspora had their own temple in Egyptian Elephantine, and they would vehemently oppose the elevation of Jerusalem temple to the status of the biblical one unless it really was the biblical one. To maintain this version, a conspiracy of coincidences is required, unless today's Israel was the real biblical Israel. Additional evidence comes from the Danish Old Testament researcher Ingrid Hjelm, who investigated the descriptions of Assyrian campaigns in the Middle East, and her analysis of the chronology and geographical environment of the Assyrian campaigns do not support the Arabian location of Israel. So, to confront the conspiracy theorists at the Badr Society, it is not that there is no political will to look into Salibi's thesis. It has been done, and the result is published in peer-reviewed journals, and the result is negative. This video has shown some of the evidence against Salibi's claims. Where this came from, there is much more. However, we should be very careful with the results of biblical archaeology. The evaluation of those follows in the next video.